guys, welcome back to my channel, Corduroy ASMR. Today we are gonna be getting back into the true crime videos. This one is going to be the case of Gerard Schaefer, who was a serial killer known as the Killer Cop, also known as the Hangman. Of course, this is a true crime video, so viewer discretion is advised. There is going to be graphic explanations of violence, of course, and particularly in this case, there is graphic descriptions of sexual violence. So take care of yourself. If that is not something that you want to hear, then do not watch this video. But let's get into the case. Gerard Schaefer was born in Neenah, Wisconsin on March 26th, 1946, the first of 3 children born to Gerard John Schaefer Sr. and Doris Marie Schaefer. His father was a traveling salesman and his mother a housewife. Schaefer was raised in Nashville, Tennessee, and later in Atlanta, Georgia, where he attended Marist Academy until his family permanently relocated to Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 1960. Schaefer later described his childhood as troubled and turbulent, largely due to the frequent family relocations, his father's alcoholism, and his father's frequent verbal abuse of his wife and his children. Although the elder Schaefer's occupation resulted in his being frequently absent from the household, he had a difficult relationship with his oldest son, who resented his frequent belittling of him and believed that his father favored his sister over himself and his brother. By contrast, Schaefer was close to his mother, who was extremely protective of her children, as any mother would be. As a child, Schaefer preferred outdoor pursuits. By his adolescence, he had developed an interest in nature. His primary interest as a teenager included collecting guns, hunting, and fishing, activities that he and his father occasionally pursued together when his father was at home. Although hardly a classic loner, classmates at St. Thomas Aquinas High School recall his not being part of any clique. He frequently pursued his interests alone, leading his family and peers alike to view him as an outdoorsman who held aspirations to become a forest ranger. By his teenage years, Schaefer developed erotic fantasies of hurting women whom he deemed worthy of his contempt. These fantasies gradually evolved into his developing a penchant for sadomasochism and bondage, and deriving pleasure from inflicting pain upon himself, occasionally as he wore women's underwear until he achieved orgasm via autoerotic asphyxia. Typically, these sadomasochistic rituals involved Schaefer tying himself to a tree in rural locations. These fantasies would increase in terms of frequency and intensity with time, gradually dominating many of his waking hours. Schaefer also became a peeping Tom in his mid-teens and is known to have developed the habit of cross-dressing. Although he dated in his high school years, several female classmates viewed him with disdain. One former classmate, Barbara Kralik, later recollected, "I can't remember him being friends with any of the guys. He was always on the outside looking in. As a matter of fact, the only thing I really remember is that I always had to tuck my skirt under my legs because Schaefer would practically stand on his head to look up a girl's skirt." Schaefer was considered a promising student by his teachers. Contemporary records reveal his being a member of the varsity football team during his sophomore and junior years, and he is known to have been an excellent golfer. He graduated from St. Thomas Aquinas High School in June of 1964, and then briefly worked as a fishing guide in the Everglades before enrolling at Broward Community College. Schaefer initially enrolled as a social studies major at Broward Community College in September of 1964, before switching his focus to teaching, in which he achieved average grades. Upon completion of his sophomore year at Broward, he applied for and was accepted for scholarship at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, where he began his studies in 1968 with aspirations to obtain a Bachelor of Arts in Education. In December of 1968, Schaefer married his fiancée, Martha, also known as Marty, Louise Fogg, a fellow FAU student, 2 years his junior, whom he had met at Broward and with whom he had briefly toured in her patriotic singing troupe, Sing Out 66, which offered an alternative to the contemporary hippie movement. The couple rented a property on SW 22nd Street in Fort Lauderdale, although the relationship soon soured, both due to Schaefer's incessant demands for sex and his spending much of his free time hunting. The two divorced on May 2nd of 1970, his wife citing Schaefer's extreme cruelty as the reason for their separation. Shortly thereafter, Schaefer formed a brief relationship with a physically disabled woman whom he encountered at a Fort Lauderdale mental health clinic, although the couple soon separated. In March of 1969, Schaefer successfully applied for a student teaching internship at Plantation High School. He began this position on September 23rd, primarily teaching geography. However, he was fired on November 7th for refusing to accept advice from his superiors and for continuously attempting to impose his own moral and or political opinions upon his students, which had led to the school receiving numerous complaints from parents. Shortly thereafter, Schaefer unsuccessfully applied for a student teaching position at Boca Raton Community High School. 4 months later, in March 1970, Schaefer successfully applied for another teaching internship. This application was accepted, and he began teaching geography at Stranahan High School on April 2nd. Contemporary progress reports indicate Schaefer performed poorly at Stranahan High, with his superiors noting both his arrogance and his very limited knowledge of the subject that he taught. 7 weeks after Schaefer commenced this teaching position, the principal of Stranahan High informed him of the school's decision to withdraw him from the internship by May 18th. His career as a student teacher formally ended the following day. Shortly after the termination of Schaefer's teaching career, he vacationed in Europe and North Africa before returning to Florida, where he briefly worked for the Wackenhut Corporation as a security guard as he pondered his next career move. On September 1st of 1970, Schaefer applied for a vacancy within the Wilton Manors Police Department. He failed to disclose the fact he had twice been fired from student teaching positions within the previous year, instead falsely claiming to have acquired 2 years' experience as a research assistant at FAU and to have recently returned to the U.S. from Morocco. Schaefer's previous work history was not verified, and he was formally inducted into the Broward County Police Department in September of 1971, graduating as a patrolman at the end of the while still working as a security guard. The two soon became engaged and married in Fort Lauderdale on September 11th of that year. According to Schaefer, his second marriage was more harmonious than his first. His second wife willingly I don't know how to say that word. Basically, she agreed with his frequent demands for sex and also shared his passion for fishing in locations such as the Florida Keys. Schaefer's tenure with the Wilton Manors police lasted only 6 months, although he earned commendation from his superiors on one occasion relating to his conduct during a March 1972 police raid on a drug house. His general performance was considered poor. He was dismissed from the position when his superiors discovered his habit of stopping cars driven by female motorists who had committed minor traffic infractions, then entering their license plate numbers into a database to obtain further personal details about them before contacting them to request dates. Girl. Shortly before this dismissal, Schaefer had begun searching for a better paying law enforcement position elsewhere. He began his service as a deputy with the Martin County Sheriff's Department on June 23rd of 1972, having forged a letter of recommendation from Wilton Manors endorsing his application. A standard background check revealed he had no criminal record. Like, did they not call them up? Like, they had phones at this point. Like, you couldn't have called them up and been like, hey, is this letter of recommendation, like, accurate and / real? Like, why wouldn't you fact check that? I don't know. Seems easily fact checked, but whatever. On the afternoon of July 21st, 1972, Schaefer encountered 2 teenage hitchhikers named Nancy Ellen Trotter, who was 18 years old, and Paula Sue Wells, who was 17 years old, while on official police duty. He drove the pair to their intended destination of Stewart, although he cautioned the girls against the perils of hitchhiking. Upon learning neither girl was native to Florida and that the two intended to travel to Jensen Beach the following day, Schaefer proposed to drive them to the location. The girls accepted his offer and agreed to meet him at a bandstand on East Ocean Boulevard at 9:15 a.m. The following morning, Schaefer arrived at the bandstand and the pre-arranged time. On this occasion, he was not wearing his uniform and driving his own vehicle. Although he convinced Trotter and Wells he was still on duty, having been switched to plainclothes undercover duties and thus driving an unmarked vehicle. Shortly after the girls entered the vehicle, Schaefer deviated from their intended route on the pretext of showing the girls an old Spanish fort near Hutchinson Island. En route, he again briefly lectured the girls against accepting lifts from random strangers and the dangers of being sold into white slavery. Before stopping the vehicle close to a dilapidated shed deep inside a remote forest where he handcuffed and gagged the girls, he then took one victim to a large cypress tree close to the Indian River, tying her legs to the trunk just below her knees before binding a noose around her neck, which he affixed to a branch in such a manner as to force her to stand upon the exposed roots to counter the pressure from the noose. Schaefer then took the other victim to another tree a short distance away, where she too was bound in a similar manner, in which she was forced to stand upon a narrow exposed tree root as a makeshift sloping plinth to counter the pressure from the noose around her neck. Both were informed that they were going to be raped and murdered by him. At that moment, Schaefer received an urgent radio dispatch informing him to immediately report to the police station. He left both girls bound and standing upon their plinths, vowing that he would soon return, and exclaiming to one of his captives, "I gotta go." Both girls were warned to try not to run away, because I'm going to be When Schaefer returned to the forest approximately 2 hours later, he discovered that both girls had escaped. He immediately returned home to call his station, where he informed Sheriff Robert Crowder, "I've done something very foolish. You'll be mad at me." Schaefer then proceeded to explain that he had decided to teach 2 girls a lesson on the risks of hitchhiking, but overdid the job. He then proceeded to explain he had abandoned the 2 in the general swampland area of Hutchinson Island, not far from the Indian River. Crowder and Lieutenant Melvin Waldron immediately proceeded to Florida State Road, where, close by the highway, they discovered a desperate, partially gagged teenage girl with her hands pinioned behind her back, swimming via a flutter kick in a subtropical river. As the officers slowed to a halt, they observed the distraught girl clamber from the riverbank with sections of her jeans and blouse shredded, attempting to gesticulate for their attention. Upon removing the gag from the girl's mouth, the officers heard her identify herself as Nancy, sputtering that her friend was somewhere in the forest. To Trotter's relief, she was informed that a truck driver had discovered Wells staggering through the woodland in the direction towards the highway approximately 45 minutes earlier, and that her friend was already at the police station. Trotter was driven to the station, where she and Wells recounted their ordeal to Crowder. Both girls stated that they had managed to escape from their bindings by gingerly writhing against their restraints and loosening their gags with their teeth as they maintained their balance upon the exposed tree roots. Each stated the process of freeing themselves had taken considerable time, and that they had been acutely aware that had they slipped, they would have been hanged. Both girls provided a detailed description of their assailant and his vehicle, before formally identifying Schaefer as the individual responsible for their ordeal. Although Schaefer repeated his insistence that he had simply overreacted in his efforts to demonstrate the dangers of hitchhiking to the 2 young women, his story was not believed. He was dismissed from the force and placed under arrest, with Crowder instructing his officers to file charges of false imprisonment and aggravated assault against him. These charges were filed the following month. Approximately 2 weeks after his arrest, Schaefer posted a $15,000 bail, thus meaning he remained at liberty prior to his scheduled November 1972 trial. He returned to the house he and his second wife rented in Stewart. His wife and in-laws noted no change in his demeanor, believing his claim to have simply been trying to teach the hitchhikers a lesson. As Schaefer awaited trial, he obtained menial employment at Quick Check. Later, it was discovered that on September 27th of 1972, Schaefer had abducted 2 teenage friends named Susan Carol Place, who was 17, and Georgia Marie Jessup, who was 16. The 2 had encountered Schaefer while all 3 attended an adult education center in Fort Lauderdale. Schaefer introduced himself to the girls as Jerry Shepard, claiming to hail from Colorado and stating that he intended to return there following a trip to Mexico. He likely feigned interest in Jessup's fascination with the concept of reincarnation and ESP, in addition to Place's love of music, in order to ingratiate himself with both girls and gain their trust. On the afternoon of their disappearance, Place's mother, Lucille, arrived home to find her daughter straightening her room. As Jessup sat upon a chair in the bedroom, both introduced Lucille to a man in his 20s whom they referred to as Jerry. Place initially informed her mother that she, Jessup, and Jerry intended to travel from Fort Lauderdale to the beach and play the guitar. Although Place's mother remained suspicious, Jerry assured her his intentions were noble. Nonetheless, she noted the vehicle registration of his 1969 Datsun. Place confirmed her mother's suspicions that she intended to leave home, although she tearfully assured her that she would be gone just for a little while, and that she would remain in contact. The girls left the Place household with Schaefer approximately 8:45 p.m. When police had not returned after 4 days, Lucille first contacted Jessup's mother, Shirley, only to learn her daughter had run away on September 27th, and that she likewise had not heard from either girl. Both girls were subsequently reported missing to Oakland Park Police. Lucille provided investigators with the vehicle registration that she had noted, in addition to a physical description of the man the girls had left her home with. The registration was traced to an entirely separate model of vehicle belonging to a St. Petersburg resident who did not resemble the Jerry Shepherd, who had a firm alibi for the date of the girls' disappearance. The sole Jerry Shepherd registered as living in Fort Lauderdale was also eliminated from police inquiries by early 1973. The teenager's disappearance had largely become a cold case. In December of 1972, Schaefer appeared in court in relation to the Trotter and Wells abductions. Due to a plea bargain his attorney strongly recommended he accept, Schaefer was able to plead guilty to just one charge of aggravated assault, for which he received a sentence of 1 year in jail, with the possibility of parole after 6 months, to be followed by 3 years probation. Upon passing sentence on December 22nd, Judge D.C. Smith informed him, "It is beyond the court's imagination to conceive how you were such a foolish and astronomic jackass as you were in this case." He allowed Schaefer's formal sentencing to be postponed until after the holidays, and Schaefer began serving his sentence in Martin County Jail on January 15, 1973. Upon leaving court on December 22nd, Schaefer informed several reporters, "I made a stupid mistake. There was no sex involved. No one was hurt." In March 1973, Lucille Place discovered a letter penned by Jerry Shepherd in her daughter's bedroom. She drove to the return address upon the letter, 333 Martin Avenue in Stewart, only to learn from the building manager that Jerry Shepherd had registered at the property under his real name, Gerard Schaefer, and that he had recently been sent to jail for the abduction and attempted hanging of 2 girls. As Lucille and her husband Ira drove around the county, she realized investigators had likely incorrectly noted Schaefer's license plate number as being registered in Pinellas County as opposed to Martin County, given the fact that most license plates she observed in Martin County began with 42 and not the 4 of Pinellas County, which investigators had previously informed her was the location of the plate that she had provided them. Upon relaying this new information to the police, Lucille discovered the plate she had noted actually belonged to a blue-green Datsun, registered to one Gerard Schaefer, who resided at 333 Martin Avenue. When questioned, Schaefer denied ever having encountered Place or her parents, although Lucille positively identified a Wilton Manors personnel photograph of Schaefer as Jerry Shepherd. On the afternoon of April 1st, a father and son searching for discarded aluminum cans discovered the extensively decomposed remains of 2 individuals scattered within and around a hole dug among trees in Oak Hammock Park, Port St. Lucie, Florida. The location of this grave was 212 feet from the nearest dirt road. The grave itself was 2 feet 3 inches deep. Deep scratch marks were evident upon the base of the tree immediately alongside the gravesite, close to where sections of a torso had been bound to the base of the trunk. One victim wore the remnants of blue jeans emblazoned with the circular emblem of the Roadrunner, whereas the other was completely nude, and a pile of clothing belonging to the descendants was discovered in nearby undergrowth. Sections of both bodies had evidently been disinterred and scattered by wildlife. with a knife or a machete. Their bodies had been decapitated after death, and their jawbones had sustained numerous fractures. One set of remains, later identified as Place, had also sustained a gunshot wound to her lower jaw, consistent with having been inflicted by a .22 caliber pistol. Furthermore, sections of wearing of tree bark upon a banyan tree approximately 9 feet from the grave indicated one or both victims had been suspended from this tree long enough to leave welt impressions within the bark prior to their deaths. The initials GJ had also been carved into a tree trunk, the roots of which bore several deep knife, machete, or axe incisions containing torn sections of clothing fibers. The bodies were taken to Dade County Medical Examiner's Office Department, where Dr. Richard Sauvierne formally identified the victims via dental records and healed bone fractures as Place and Jessup on April 5th. Shortly thereafter, Schaefer was informed of the identifications. He immediately requested the representation of a public defender. The individual appointed as his legal representative was Elton Schwartz. The location of these discoveries and the descendants' identities, plus, I feel like I'm not saying that word right, descendants, plus the similarities in the modus operandi of the method of abduction and murder of Place and Jessup to Schaefer's earlier captivity of Trotter and Wells, led the police in Broward County and Martin County to obtain search warrants for Schaefer's house and vehicle, as well as the home of his mother, after Lucille Place formally identified Schaefer as being the man she had last seen with her daughter and Jessup. Inside a locked bedroom at the Fort Lauderdale residence of Schaefer's mother, police found 300 pages of lurid stories. Schaefer had both penned and typed over the course of several years. These stories detailed the kidnapping, humiliation, rape, and execution by hanging of a number of teenage girls and young women, whom he routinely referred to as whores, sluts, and harlots, including 2 named Belinda and Carmen, and an unidentified woman whom he graphically describes hanging at an unknown location close to Powerline Road. Several of these narratives indicate Schaefer had forced his victims to drink beverages, typically beer or wine, as they stood upon makeshift plinths with a noose around their necks so that he could observe them urinate. Prior to their hanging, he had frequently returned to his crime scenes weeks or months after the actual murders in order to commit acts of necrophilia with buried and dismembered bodies, or to extract teeth from the skull. His writings also revealed his fascination with historical methods of torture and execution, and the pleasure that he derived from observing acutely distressed females urinate and or defecate prior to and at the time of their hanging. Also found at the Fort Lauderdale residence were 11 guns, bags filled with live and spent cartridges, 13 hunting knives, sections of rope, and scores of softcore porn magazines which he had modified to depict nude urinating women bound with ropes hanging from trees or other makeshift gallows or bearing bullet wounds. Other images recovered were 37 black and white Polaroid photographs depicting women being hanged and or mutilated, typically within Maluka thickets suspected to be in an undergrowth area in Davie, although the focus of these images was insufficient to permit identification of the subjects. Several other images depicted Schaefer dressed in female garments, simulating his own hanging from a tree with fecal matter smeared across his buttocks. A letter dated July 20th, 1971, from an individual in Brunswick, East Victoria, Australia, whom Schaefer had become two had encountered following what his companion termed a WOG massacre of both Europeans and Arabs. Several of these images depicted women who had been extensively disemboweled and otherwise mutilated with knives and axes. Inside a gold jewelry box, investigators discovered personal possessions such as jewelry, passports, and clothing belonging to several teenage girls and young women. Some of these items, such as distinctive heart-shaped charm inscribed with the initials MTN, investigators were unable to link to missing or murdered individuals. Others were identified as belonging to young women who had been reported missing in the recent years. One gold locket inscribed with the name Lee was determined to belong to a missing woman named Lee Hainline Bonadies, who had been a neighbor of Schaefer's when both were teenagers, and who had been missing since September of 1969. Also recovered was a driver's license belonging to Barbara Ann Wilcox and a passport belonging to Colette Marie Goodenough, both of whom had been reporting missing in January of 1973. Furthermore, teeth and sections of bone, later identified as belonging to at least 8 victims, were also recovered from the property. The April 6th search of Schaefer's Martin County residence yielded less physical evidence, although investigators did recover 2 human teeth stowed in a plastic capsule inside the master bedroom, several knives and firearms inside a utility shed, and an extensively blood-stained white pillowcase, which had evidently been washed. Jessup's distinctive suede purse was discovered to have been in the possession of Schaefer's wife. She later informed police her husband had given her the item as a gift in about November of the previous year, but had attempted to persuade both her and his brother-in-law, Henry Dean, to discard the item upon learning of the April 1st discoveries in Oak-Hammock Park, with the explanation that the police may use the item to make up some kind of evidence against him. Despite Schaefer's efforts, his brother-in-law had given the item to the police. By May 12th, investigators had gathered enough physical evidence. And circumstantial evidence to link Schaefer to 9 murders and unsolved disappearances dating between 1969 and 1973. The same month, a periodical published a list of 28 murdered or missing individuals that were believed to be linked to Schaefer. The majority of these individuals hailed from Florida, although 2 victims each hailed from Iowa and West Virginia. On May 18th, Schaefer was formally charged with first-degree murder for the killings of Place and Jessup. He was held without bond pending trial and transferred to Florida State Hospital to undergo 30 days of psychiatric examinations before being returned to St. Lucie Jail on June 20th. The results of these examinations revealed Schaefer to be an individual suffering from paranoia, psychosis, and acute sexual deviation who viewed himself as an eliminator of women he deemed immoral, but nonetheless mentally competent to stand trial. Schaefer was brought to trial on September 17th, 1973. He was tried in St. Lucie County before Judge Trowbridge. As the murders of Place and Jessup had been committed at a time when the Supreme Court of Florida had declared capital punishment unconstitutional in the state, prosecutors sought life imprisonment for Schaefer. The defendant pleaded not guilty to the charges against him and frequently conveyed a distant and aloof demeanor throughout the official proceedings, often staring coldly at prosecution witnesses as they testified, or turning to smile at the members of the press when a witness testified for his counsel. Following the closing arguments, the jury began their deliberations at 3:45 p.m. They deliberated for 5 hours hours and 10 minutes before returning with 2 verdicts of a first-degree murder, which Judge Trowbridge formally announced to the court at 11:05 p.m. And finally, on December 3rd of 1995, Schaefer was stabbed to death on the floor of his cell. He had been stabbed over 40 times, about the face, head, neck, and body, with his throat also being slashed, his right eye destroyed, and several ribs fractured. His body was discovered after a fellow inmate informed staff of his death. According to prison officials and prosecutors, a 32-year-old fellow inmate named Vincent Rivera had killed Schaefer following an argument over who received the final cup of hot water from a dispenser days prior to his murder. Rivera was convicted of Schaefer's murder in 1999. He received 53 years and 10 months imprisonment added to the sentence of life, plus 20 years he was already serving for a double homicide committed in Tampa. Jeez. It is suspected that Schaefer was killed for being a prison informant, as in the year prior to his murder, other inmates had repeatedly thrown human waste at him and twice set his cell on fire. Reportedly, Schaefer's classification officer confirmed that he was murdered in a direct response to his leaking confidential information to authorities pertaining to a well-respected and powerful inmate. Alright, you guys, that is the end of this case and of this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on this one, and also recommend some other cases that you would like me to cover, because I do want to get back into making some true crime videos for you guys. I know a lot of people have commented on it that they would like me to do them again, so let me know if you have any ones that you would like me to cover. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next